Let's start with the Who. Before their names became forever linked with one of the most famous UFO stories of all time, Betty and Barney Hill were just an ordinary couple living a quiet life in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Barney, a veteran of World War II, worked a steady job for the United States Postal Service. Betty was a dedicated social worker. They were a respected, hard-working couple, actively involved in their local community and their Unitarian church. What made them slightly unusual for the time was that they were an interracial couple. Barney was African American and Betty was white, at a time in American history when such marriages were not common. Their life was grounded, stable, and decidedly normal. Which makes what happened next all the more extraordinary and compelling for those who study these mysteries. Their story isn't just about strange lights in the sky, it's about two credible, down-to-earth people who found themselves at the center of a phenomenon that defied all logical explanation. They weren't seeking fame or fortune. In fact, for a long time they were reluctant to even speak about their experience, fearing ridicule and disbelief. This reluctance is a key part of their story's credibility. They were not UFO enthusiasts or people prone to fantastical stories. They were simply two individuals trying to make sense of a deeply unsettling event that shattered their perception of reality. Their journey from confusion and fear to a quest for answers is what makes their account a cornerstone of ufology and a story that continues to captivate us decades later. The backdrop for this incredible event was a simple vacation. In September of 1961, the Hills decided to take a well-deserved trip, driving up to Niagara Falls in Montreal, Canada. It was a chance to relax and enjoy some time together away from their daily routines. The trip itself was uneventful, filled with the typical sights and experiences of a road trip holiday. As they began their drive home, winding through the scenic but isolated roads of New England, they had no reason to suspect that their journey would be anything but ordinary. Little did they know, the final leg of their trip, a late-night drive through New Hampshire's White Mountains, would mark the beginning of an ordeal that would change their lives, and our culture, forever. What makes the Betty and Barney Hill case so special is that it became the first widely publicized and well-documented account of an alien abduction in modern history. It wasn't just a fleeting glimpse of a strange object, it was a detailed, multi-layered narrative that included media group, reenactment of a couple seeing lights in the night sky from a car, bright light in a rural sky distribute equally, close-up sightings, a period of missing time, physical evidence and deeply personal memories recalled under clinical hypnosis. Their story laid the groundwork for thousands of similar accounts that would follow, establishing many of the classic elements we now associate with abduction phenomena, from the appearance of the gray aliens to the medical examinations they supposedly perform. Their ordinary lives were about to collide with the extraordinary in the most profound way imaginable. The night was September 19, 1961. Betty and Barney, accompanied by their dachshund Delcy, were driving south on United States Route 3, making their way home through the dark, sparsely populated landscape of the White Mountains. The sky was clear and dotted with stars. It was around 10:30 when Betty noticed something unusual. A bright point of light was moving erratically across the sky, darting in ways that a normal aircraft like a plane or a satellite simply couldn't. Intrigued, she pointed it out to Barney, who was initially skeptical. He dismissed it as a commercial airplane on its way to Montreal, but Betty, who had a keen interest in astronomy, was convinced it was something else entirely. The object seemed to be pacing their car, growing brighter and larger. As they continued driving, the strange light became impossible to ignore. It descended from the sky, its movements becoming more deliberate and directed, as if it were observing them. The Hills pulled over several times to get a better look. Near the town of Twin Mountain, Betty took out a pair of binoculars and saw that the object was not just a light, but a distinct physical craft. It was flat and circular like a pancake, with a row of multicolored flashing lights along its rim. It was rotating silently as it hovered in the night sky. The initial curiosity they felt began to morph into a sense of unease. This was no ordinary aircraft, it was something completely outside their realm of experience, and it was getting closer. Barney, ever the pragmatist, was still trying to find a rational explanation, but his skepticism was rapidly fading. The craft was now moving directly toward them, its silent, purposeful advance becoming more and more intimidating. They got back in their car and drove on, but the object shadowed them, eventually descending so low that it looked as if it was going to land right on the highway in front of them. The sheer size of it was overwhelming, blocking out the stars above. The feeling of being watched intensified, and a sense of dread began to wash over the couple. They were alone on a dark, remote road with a massive, unidentified object hovering just a few hundred feet away. This initial sighting is the crucial first chapter in their ordeal. It marks the transition from a normal, everyday drive to the beginning of a high-strangeness event. The slow buildup of tension, from a curious light in the distance to a massive, silent craft descending upon them, is a powerful part of their narrative. It highlights their initial disbelief and their gradual realization that they were witnessing something truly inexplicable. Their decision to stop the car for a closer look was a fateful one, a choice born of curiosity that would lead them down a path into one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. The light in the sky was no longer a distant anomaly. It was an imminent and terrifying presence. The situation escalated dramatically near Indian Head. The enormous, silent craft had maneuvered itself to hover directly in front of the Hill's 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, forcing them to a stop in the middle of the road. Barney, feeling a mix of fear and a protective instinct, decided he needed to get a closer look to identify what they were dealing with. He grabbed his .32 caliber pistol from the glove compartment, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the object, which now floated silently about 80 to 100 feet above the ground. Using the binoculars, he focused on the craft, and what he saw chilled him to the bone. Through a row of windows he could clearly see several humanoid figures moving inside. He described them as non-human, dressed in what looked like shiny black uniforms. They seemed to be looking directly down at him as if he were an exhibit. The figures moved with a cold, efficient precision that was deeply unsettling. As he stood there, frozen in a state of terror and disbelief, he felt as if a message was being communicated to him without words. "Stay where you are and keep looking." Then one figure, who seemed to be a leader, stood at the central window staring down at him. At that moment Barney had the overwhelming feeling that they were about to be captured. He later recalled screaming, "They're going to capture us!" as he tore the binoculars from his eyes and ran back to the car. As Barney scrambled back into the driver's seat, yelling at Betty to roll up the window, the air was filled with a strange series of buzzing or beeping sounds. He frantically started the car and sped away, trying to put as much distance as possible between them and the terrifying craft. They could feel a strange tingling sensation, a vibration that seemed to pass through the car and their bodies. The beeping sounds seemed to grow louder, then suddenly stopped. A heavy drowsiness overcame them both, a state of altered consciousness that clouded their awareness. Their memory of what happened immediately after this point became a complete and total blank. This close encounter was the terrifying climax of the initial sighting. Barney's account of seeing the figures inside the craft is one of the most chilling and specific details of their story. His visceral fear, the feeling of being targeted and about to be captured, was a profound psychological trauma that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The strange buzzing sounds and the sudden onset of drowsiness marked the transition to the next, and most mysterious phase of their experience. They had been pursued, confronted, and now, something was happening to them that was beyond their control, and for a time, beyond their memory. The journey had been irrevocably interrupted. The next thing Betty and Barney Hill remembered with any clarity was finding themselves back in their car, driving down the highway. The strange buzzing had stopped, and the heavy feeling of drowsiness had lifted, replaced by a sense of confusion and disorientation. They looked at each other, trying to piece together what had just happened. They had a vague, fragmented memory of driving away from the hovering craft, but everything after the series of beeps was a void. It was as if a section of their journey and their lives had been neatly excised from their minds. They continued driving, the silence in the car thick with unspoken fear and bewilderment. When they passed through the town of Ashland, New Hampshire, they noticed a road sign and realized something was profoundly wrong. They were approximately 35 miles south of where their last conscious memory had been. They looked at their watches to check the time, only to find that both of their timepieces had stopped working. When they finally arrived home in Portsmouth, they checked the kitchen clock. It was just after 5 o'clock in the morning. A drive that should have taken them around 4 hours had somehow taken nearly 7. Roughly 2 hours of their time was completely unaccounted for. This phenomenon, which investigators would later dub missing time, became one of the most baffling and significant elements of their case. The concept of missing time was a new and disturbing idea in the context of UFO encounters. It suggested that witnesses were not just seeing strange things, but were being directly affected by them in ways that manipulated their consciousness and memory. For the Hills, this gap in their awareness was a source of immense anxiety. What had happened during those 2 lost hours? They had no answers, only a deep, nagging feeling that something terrible and invasive had occurred. This blank spot in their timeline was a psychological wound that refused to heal, prompting them to eventually seek answers through unconventional means. The 2-hour gap represents the core of the abduction mystery. It is the period during which the most extraordinary events of their story are alleged to have taken place, events they would only be able to recall years later under hypnosis. On that night, however, all they knew was that a significant portion of their experience was missing, leaving them with an incomplete and terrifying puzzle. They had been pursued, confronted, and then for 2 hours they had simply vanished from their own narrative. Their journey had been interrupted in the most profound way possible, and the quest to understand why would define the rest of their lives. Upon arriving home, tired and shaken, the Hills began to notice a series of strange physical clues that suggested their experience was more than just a frightening sighting. Their clothes were inexplicably torn and scuffed. Barney's best dress shoes were scraped down to the leather on the tops, which, honestly, was an impossible type of damage to incur simply by driving a car. Betty's dress was ripped in several places at the zipper and hemline, and it was covered in a strange pinkish powder that she just couldn't identify. Even their dog, Delcy, was unusually quiet and seemed distressed. These small but significant details added another layer of physical reality to their bizarre experience, suggesting that some kind of physical struggle or event had taken place. But, the physical evidence wasn't limited to their clothing. The next day, Barney went out to inspect their car in the daylight. He discovered a series of shiny, concentric circles on the trunk of the Chevrolet. These marks were about the size of a silver dollar, and were perfectly arranged in a pattern. When he brought a compass near the spots, the needle would spin wildly, indicating that the area had been subjected to a powerful magnetic field. They tried to wash the marks off, but they remained, as if the metal itself had been altered. These strange circles on their car served as tangible, lasting proof that something had made physical contact with their vehicle during the night. In the days and weeks that followed, the psychological toll of the incident became increasingly apparent. Betty began having a series of vivid, recurring nightmares. In these dreams, she and Barney were taken by strange-looking men onto a craft and subjected to medical examinations. The dreams were so detailed and disturbing that she wrote them down. Barney, on the other hand, experienced a different reaction. He developed severe anxiety, high blood pressure, and a painful ring of genital warts that appeared shortly after the incident and required surgery. He was consciously trying to block out the memory of the encounter, but his body was reacting to the trauma his mind refused to acknowledge. The combination of physical evidence and psychological distress created a compelling, if confusing, picture. The torn clothes, the mysterious pink powder, the magnetized spots on the car, Betty's nightmares, and Barney's physical ailments were all pieces of a puzzle they simply couldn't solve. They reported their initial UFO sighting to Pease Air Force Base but downplayed the more bizarre aspects for fear of being dismissed as crazy. The official investigation was brief and inconclusive, labeling it a simple misidentification of the planet Jupiter. But for the Hills, the lingering evidence and their own suffering told a much different and far more terrifying story. 2 years passed, but the trauma of that night in 1961 just refused to fade away. Barney's anxiety and health problems only got worse. And Betty, well, she remained haunted by her nightmares. The missing 2 hours were a constant source of stress for them both. On the advice of their doctor, they were referred to Dr. Benjamin Simon, a respected Boston psychiatrist and neurologist who specialized in treating trauma through hypnosis. The Hills hoped he could help them uncover the source of their anxiety and, maybe, recover those lost memories from that night. Dr. Simon was initially skeptical of any UFO connection, believing their issues probably stemmed from the stress of being an interracial couple in a prejudiced society. Beginning in January 1964, Dr. Simon conducted a series of intensive hypnosis sessions with Betty and Barney over a period of 6 months. Crucially, he hypnotized them separately, so that one's account couldn't influence the other. Under hypnosis, the floodgates of their memories just opened up. The stories that emerged were detailed, emotional and, honestly, shockingly consistent with each other. They both independently recounted being stopped on the road not once, but twice. The second time, their car engine died, and a group of short, gray-skinned beings emerged from the woods and took them from their vehicle, leading them up a ramp into the hovering alien craft. During these sessions, their emotions were raw and palpable. Barney in particular would relive the terror of the experience, his voice filled with fear and anguish as he described being forcibly taken aboard the ship. He recalled the being's strange appearance. They were small, with large pear-shaped heads, and huge dark eyes that seemed to wrap around the sides of their heads. Their skin was a grayish color and they communicated with him through a form of telepathy, their thoughts entering his mind directly. Betty's recollections were similarly detailed, and she described the beings with a sense of detached, clinical curiosity that really contrasted with Barney's terror. Dr. Simon, despite his initial skepticism, was struck by the consistency and emotional depth of their accounts. While he never publicly endorsed the story as a literal alien abduction, he concluded that the Hills were not fabricating their story. He believed they were honestly recounting a shared fantasy or a distorted memory of a traumatic event, but he could not deny the sincerity of their belief. The hypnosis sessions provided a narrative for the 2 hours of missing time, filling in the blank with a story of abduction and examination. For Betty and Barney, it was the key that finally unlocked the mystery that had tormented them for years. Under the careful guidance of Dr. Simon, Betty and Barney both provided vivid, independent descriptions of what happened to them inside the craft. They recalled being separated and taken into different rooms for physical examinations. Barney described being laid down on a rectangular table in a metallic, sterile-looking room. The beings, who he perceived as cold and clinical, proceeded to examine him thoroughly. They inspected his eyes, ears, and throat. They pulled on his teeth and took scrapings from his skin and clippings of his fingernails. He remembered them examining his skeletal structure and nervous system with a device that passed over his body. The experience was terrifying and humiliating, leaving him feeling like a laboratory animal. Betty's examination was similar in some ways but different in others. She too was placed on a table while the beings examined her. Like Barney, they took samples of her hair and nails. However, her examination focused more on her reproductive system. She described, with a mix of pain and confusion, a long, sharp needle being inserted into her navel. She was told it was a pregnancy test. The procedure caused a wave of intense pain, but when she cried out, the being she identified as the leader placed his hand over her eyes, and the pain vanished instantly. This combination of invasive procedures and advanced, almost magical abilities was a recurring theme in her account. Beyond the physical examinations, Betty recalled having a conversation with the leader. She was able to ask him questions and he responded telepathically. She asked where they were from, a question that led to one of the most famous pieces of evidence in their case. The leader showed her a three-dimensional map projected on a screen, which displayed stars connected by lines of various thicknesses. He explained that the thick lines were established trade routes, the thin lines were places they visited occasionally, and the dotted lines represented expeditions. When Betty asked him to point out her sun on the map, he replied that since she didn't know where she was in the cosmos, it would be meaningless to show her. These detailed recollections, brought forth under hypnosis, formed the core of the abduction narrative that would become so influential. The description of the beings, short, gray-skinned with large, dark wraparound eyes, would become the archetypal image of the gray alien in popular culture. The clinical, detached nature of the examination, the focus on sample collection and the telepathic communication would all become standard elements in subsequent abduction reports. For the Hills, these were not elements of a story. They were recovered memories of a real and deeply personal trauma that they were finally able to articulate. For a time, the Hills' story really remained a private matter, shared only with Dr. Simon and a small circle of trust. They had no desire for public attention. Betty, however, had shared the account of their sighting with the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, or NICAP, a civilian UFO research group. An investigator from the group, Walter Webb, a lecturer at the Hayden Planetarium, interviewed them extensively and found them to be highly credible witnesses. Word began to leak out within their community after they shared a version of their story at their church. A reporter for the Boston Traveler newspaper, John H. Luttrell, got wind of the story and obtained a secret recording of their talk, publishing a sensationalized, multi-part series in 1965. The unwanted publicity forced the Hills into the spotlight. To correct the inaccuracies and sensationalism of the newspaper articles, they decided to cooperate with author John G. Fuller, who wrote the 1966 best-selling book, The Interrupted Journey. The book presented their story in a factual, sensitive manner, including excerpts from Dr. Simon's hypnosis tapes. It brought the Betty and Barney Hill case to national and international attention, transforming it from a private trauma into a public phenomenon. The book was a massive success and was later adapted into a popular 1975 television movie, The UFO Incident, starring James Earl Jones as Barney and Estelle Parsons as Betty. Their story was now firmly embedded in the public consciousness. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence to emerge from their account was the star map that Betty had been shown by the leader. After the hypnosis sessions, she was able to draw the map from memory. It depicted a dozen major stars connected by various lines. For years, the map remained a curiosity, an unprovable detail from her memory. Then in 1968, a brilliant amateur astronomer and teacher from Ohio named Marjorie Fish decided to investigate it. She built dozens of three-dimensional models of stars in our galactic neighborhood, painstakingly trying to find a perspective that matched Betty's drawing. After years of work, she found a near-perfect match. The pattern, Fish concluded, represented the view of our sun from the perspective of the binary star system Zeta Reticuli, located approximately 39 light-years from Earth. The stars in Betty's map corresponded precisely with known stars in that region of space, many of which were not even widely known or catalogued in 1961. This apparent correlation was seen by many as stunning validation of Betty's account. While some astronomers have since disputed Fish's interpretation, the Zeta Reticuli star map remains one of the most debated and fascinating pieces of evidence in the history of ufology, a tangible link between a personal memory and the vastness of the cosmos. The story of Betty and Barney Hill is more than just a single isolated report of a strange event. It is a foundational text in the modern mythology of UFOs and alien encounters. Their account was the first to introduce the complete abduction narrative to a wide audience: the pursuit, the missing time, the capture, the onboard examination by non-human beings, and the return with wiped memories. Nearly every abduction story that has come to light since owes a debt to the template established by the Hills. Their detailed description of the gray aliens with large dark eyes became the dominant image of extraterrestrial visitors, replacing the little green men of earlier science fiction. The case had a profound impact on both popular culture and the field of ufology. It sparked a wave of interest in the abduction phenomenon, encouraging others who had similar experiences to come forward. It also brought the use of hypnotic regression into the mainstream as a tool for investigating UFO encounters, a practice that remains both popular and controversial. Books, documentaries, and television shows have endlessly analyzed and retold their story, ensuring that each new generation is familiar with the couple who took an interrupted journey through the White Mountains. The case has become a permanent fixture in our collective conversation about life beyond Earth. Sadly, the experience took a heavy toll on the Hills. Barney never fully recovered from the trauma and the stress it placed on his health. He passed away from a cerebral hemorrhage in 1969 at the young age of 46. Betty, however, lived until 2004, becoming a celebrated figure in the UFO community. She continued to speak about her experience, investigate other sightings, and steadfastly maintain the truth of her account until the very end. She never wavered in her belief that she and Barney had been taken aboard an alien spacecraft that night in 1961. Her conviction and dedication to her story were really remarkable. The Betty and Barney Hill abduction remains a landmark case because of its complexity, the credibility of the witnesses, and the rich tapestry of evidence it produced, from physical traces on their car to the star map drawn from memory. Skeptics can point to psychological explanations, suggesting shared delusions or the influence of Cold War anxieties. Believers can point to the physical evidence and the uncanny consistency of their hypnotically recalled memories. Regardless of what one chooses to believe, the story of Betty and Barney Hill endures. It stands as a powerful and haunting human story about two ordinary people who were confronted by an extraordinary mystery that continues to defy easy explanation.